In the summer of 1666, Shabtai Tzvi's conversion to Islam shattered hopes and dreams, leaving Jewish communities grappling with the aftermath of a false redeemer. One contentious issue arose in Amsterdam, where leaders debated whether to continue the performance of Birchas Kohanim each Shabbos, which was initiated during Shabtai's self-proclaimed messianic era. Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas penned a series of halachic responsa on this matter, tackling the challenge of ideas proposed by flawed individuals and customs initiated by misguided beliefs.
Our story tonight takes us back to the years 1665 and 1666. During that time, it was a very tumultuous period for Am Yisrael because of the Shabtai Tzvi story. And that is that news broke and really reached many different cities around the world in the year 1665 that there's a person who is the Mashiach. And then as the year continued and turned into 1666, toward the end of the year, in Elul of that year, he was summoned before the Sultan in Constantinople, and he was offered a choice of to either be killed, executed, or to convert to Islam, which he did. And so with that, up in flames went the dreams of many Yidden who were around the world and who had received letters and heard reports about the great potential that was there for their taking. And it is within that context that we're going to look tonight at a tshuva that appears in a sefer that's called Shalos Tshuvas Oyel Yaakov. Shalos Tshuvas Oyel Yaakov was authored by a rabbi who at this period in time is living in Hamburg. His name is Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas. Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas is born in North Africa, and that's where he becomes an adult. And later he emigrates and he bounces around from city to city. There's a time he lives in Amsterdam, there's a time he lives in London, and he's a Svardische Chacham. But in these years, in 1665, 1666, he's living in Hamburg. At the time, Hamburg, the only Jews who lived in Hamburg were diaspora Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, the Hainu Svardische Jews. The Ashkenazim did not live in Hamburg. They weren't allowed to live in Hamburg. They lived outside Hamburg, and then it was a separate city called Altena, which was right next to Hamburg. And that's where the Ashkenazim lived. The Sephardim lived in Hamburg, and he, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas, was in Hamburg with the Sephardim there. And he sees the letters, he gets the reports, he sees everything that's happening, and from the beginning he was a very big skeptic. And he felt that Jews moved too fast to believe. Much can be said about the topic, but we're going to focus tonight on a very specific issue that appears in his Shalos Tshuvas Oyel Yaakov, Siman Samaches. So let's read the tshuva. Sha'alta, there's a shaila from a Jew from Amsterdam. There was a Jew in Amsterdam whose name was Rabbi Yitzchak Nunez, who asked the following question. This question is dated Parshas Miketz, the year 1666, meaning December 1666 is already the year Tov Chav Zayin in the Jewish counting. So Shabtai Tzvi had already converted to Islam a few months before. And now the question appears at the desk of Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas. When the news first came about the false prophet and the Mashiach, and here he says, Rasha Tevis, Shatzam Yeshu. In other words, the Shabtai Tzvi, the mem stands for Mashiach. We'll see more about that later. And Yamach Shemoy V'Zichroi. Okay, some people are particular not to say Yamach Shemoy about another Jew, no matter whom, but Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas was not particular about that. So when the initial reports came about Shabtai Tzvi, Na'agu B'Kehalchem, in your community, meaning in Amsterdam, the community had the custom, Loimar Birchas Kohanim B'chol Shabbos. They instituted a new custom to recite Birchas Kohanim every single Shabbos. Mashaloi noagu mikoidon lechein, which was not the minig prior to that. In other words, the minig prior to that was the same, like the way we do today here in Crown Heights. We say Birchas Kohanim on Yom Tov. And that was the minig of the Svardim who were living in Amsterdam at the time. They only did Birchas Kohanim on Yom Tov. Kim b'yomim tovim bolvad. And now, when the news of Shabtai Tzvi came to Amsterdam, they changed and they said, we're going to start doing Birchas Kohanim every single Shabbos. Why? They wanted to be more scrupulous about the observance of mitzvahs. Doing it properly. Because this is the proper way to prepare for the coming of Mashiach. Indeed, we know from other places as well that in many different communities there were areas where there was a certain laxity in observance of a certain area of halacha, and when news came that good things are about to happen, the Jews did tshuva and they changed. And there are numerous reports about that. In fact, there's a memoir from a Jewish woman who lived not too far from where Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas is here. He's in Hamburg. And she, she didn't live in Altena. She was in times in Altena. But she lived in the general region in Germany. Her name was Glickel of Hamlin. And Glickel of Hamlin writes about the tshuva that the Svardish Jews were engaged in at the time in Hamburg. And so this is something that is widely reported, and that's what we're seeing over here. Now, in order, and we're not going to do questions now. In order to us to understand what's happening over here, we need to take a step back and ask the following question, and that is, one second, what's the din? Is the din taka that a person should be doing Birchas Kohanim every single day? If the din is a person should be doing Birchas Kohanim every single day, so what happened there? So the MS is that the din is that the din is, minad din, Birchas Kohanim is supposed to happen every day, every single day. So let's trace a little how this fell out of use. So that brings us to the Sefer HaOgur. The Sefer HaOgur was authored in the late 1400s by a Rav by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Landau. What's unique about this Sefer is they say that it's the first halachic Sefer that was printed b'chaya HaMechaber, which means that he brought his Sefer to print. During the early years of Jewish print, all of the books were classics from prior generations. Who's the first rabbi to show up at the printing press and say, here's the Sefer I authored, please publish it? It's Rabbi Yaakov Landau. And because this Sefer was printed in Naples in 1490. Anyway, he writes as follows. Nishal Gadol Ador Mahari Moilid. So he's saying there's a shaila from the Maharil. The Maharil is the great Rav who lives in the Rhineland between 1355 and 1427. And the Maharil is asked the shaila. What's the shaila? Why don't we observe the custom of doing Birchas Kohanim every single day, given that it's a mitzvah saseh? So why are we not doing it? By the way, this is the earliest source that tells us, that I know of, that Jews weren't observing this mitzvah. In other words, if you look at the earlier sources, we don't see any discussion of them not doing it every single day. The Heishiv. So the Maharil answered, there is a custom that the Kohanim should go to mikveh, as it says in Agois Maiminis. We don't have it in our Agois Maiminis, but we have it in Maram Rottenburg. There's a passage in Maram Rottenburg talking about in the 1200s that the Kohanim were very makbid to go to mikveh before they do. Every day that you're going to start going to mikveh and it's the winter and it's cold, it's difficult. The truth is we have a parallel passage in the Tshuva, the Maharil, that's in the Maharil HaChadoshes, and over there, it's not only about the weather, it's a little more complicated. And that is that Kohanim felt that, what's the idea of the mikveh? The idea of the mikveh wasn't mamish that you had to go to mikveh before. As if a person had the din of a Baal Keri, so then he would go to the mikveh before during Birchas Kohanim. So all of a sudden it becomes uncomfortable. I'm going to mikveh, that person didn't go to mikveh. All of a sudden people's private lives are a little more on display. And so in the passage in the Shalos Shuvas Maharil HaChadoshes that parallels this one, he emphasizes that point, that this is why they said, something, it's not only about the temperature of the river, it was more about the privacy of people. And so therefore they felt, so let's just scrap it. And we're not going to do it on any other day, except for Yom Tov. So the weather, from the weather angle, you would say, first of all, the Yom Tovim, it's never freezing cold. Second of all, it's only a few days of the year, so not such a big deal. And in terms of the privacy, everyone goes out of Yom Tov to mikvah, and that's it. And we some of the Achronim said that if you follow the logic then there was the couples were not supposed to be intimate on Yom Tov by night, the Kohanim at least, in order to make sure that they're not about carry during the time of Birchas Kohanim. Okay, so this is the reason that the Maharil is giving for why this new phenomena, so to speak, that we're not doing Birchas Kohanim. I don't know if anyone really knows exactly when and how this thing developed to stop doing Birchas Kohanim. But here we see the Maharil. By the way, he actually quotes in the name of his Shver, so really it goes a little earlier. The name of his Shver, that this idea that we're not that we're not doing it, he comes up with this justification. This is why we're only doing it on Yom Tov. Then he says, "V'gam mitam bitul malacha." There's another reason. It takes time, especially if you sing it the way we sing it. And so those extra few minutes that it takes, and now we're not able to go to work. It's hard enough to get people to come to shul for shachris, for a minyan, and so therefore, mishum bitul malacha, we're not doing it. Uksha koyin einei nikra. And the Sefer Oger adds one last point from the Maharil. If you're not called up, meaning if we don't say, if the Chazan doesn't say koyanim, calling up the koyanim to come up, then einei over, there's no aveira. And so therefore, it's not like if a person, a Yid misses tefillin one day, he's mavatal mitzvahs asay, that's a shrek l'chazach. If a kohen doesn't do birchas koyanim, if einei nikra, if he wasn't summoned to come up on the chazan, so then the asay was never even triggered. There was no chiyuv of the asay, and so therefore it isn't necessary. This is what the Sefer Oger writes in the name of the Maharil. Now, the Beis Yosef, in his work and his commentary, was not happy about this passage. And look what he writes about it. He writes, "Dochak atzmoi lekayem minig mekoymai." This is a stretch, trying to substantiate and justify what was going on, that Maharil in Ashkenaz, they weren't doing Birchas Kohanim every day. Ve'inayim aspik, it's not a good enough reason. Why? Sharei tefillah l'nesiyas kapayim lo huskara b'talmud. Nowhere does it say in the Gemara that you have to go to the mikveh before duchenim. And then he goes on to say, so they took on a chumrah over here, but the chumrah turns into a kula. Then now, because of this extra special chumrah, so they're not doing the mitzvahs I say that they needed. Right? Like the person who said that he doesn't want to go to shul Friday night because he doesn't want to make kiddush between 6 and 7. So he's so makbid on doing, so he's going to stay home and daven ma'ariv at home, right? So okay. And it's true that there is no asay until you're summoned by the chazan. Still, everyone agrees it's better to put yourself in a situation that you tell the chazan to call them up. So now there is an asay, and by the way, it's 3 asays. Why is it 3 asays? Because looking at the psukim, we're going to see later, there's 3 psukim that we look at that tell the kohanim to give the bracha to Yidden, and so therefore it's 3 asays. Continues Rabbi Yosef Karo in this passage and concludes V'yashar koicham shel bnei Eretz Yisrael, praising the bnei Eretz Yisrael v'chol malchus Mitzrayim, and also the Jewish communities in Mitzrayim, that they shanoisim kapeim b'chol yom, they do it every day, and without going to the mikveh. And this is what the Mechaber says is supposed to be the right thing. So the bottom line is like this: sometimes it's not entirely clear. Birchas Kohanim stops becoming a daily practice and becomes only a practice on Yom Tov. And we saw 3 points, 2 justifications that were given to it. One justification was the mikveh issue. The second was bitul malacha, and it was added the point that it's anyway not a real chiyuv until the chazan calls them up, and so therefore this wasn't being done. But I think Jews understood that this wasn't ideal. They understood the Beis Yosef is the ideal. The Beis Yosef is telling you, put yourself in a situation where you do have the chiyuv. That's the best way to live. So now let's go back to the years of Shabtai Tzvi, 1665 and 1666. And you have the Kehillah in Amsterdam that's excited about what's supposed to happen. And so therefore they want to better their observance in Torah and mitzvahs. They choose this area of Birchas Kohanim, not to redo it every day. Not to redo it every day. It was only every Shabbos. Today there are some places where they do Birchas Kohanim every day. There are some places that do it every Shabbos. There are places that do it only on Yom Tov. Where's the first place where there's a mucker for the idea of doing it on Shabbos but not every day? I can't say I looked exhaustively, but as far as I can tell, this is the earliest place where we see this idea of Shabbos but not every single day. And again, the reason they did this was they wanted to advance in their Avodas Hashem, getting better. Okay. So what's the shaila? What's the halacha over here? So let's go to number 4 to continue reading what the question was. The kasher, he says that now what happened, and in his poetic, very biblical language, he talks about Shabtai Tzvi's conversion in Elul of 1666, excuse me. And we were at fault, he says, because we were too soon. Kalim lahamin kol davar. He said, we went too soon. And there's a long arichas about this, and maybe for another time, where he says, you didn't follow the Rambam, you have to look at the Rambam and Hilchos Malachim, you didn't follow the criteria of the Rambam. And we didn't look at Divrei Razal. And so therefore, we ended up in this situation where everyone realizes, okay, he converted, and almost all you didn't realize, okay, forget it, it's over, and that he's not Mashiach. So now the Shaila was, Hashem Yizen Nira L'Ksas Gvirim, some of the prominent members in Amsterdam say, let's go back. Let's snap back to the way we were doing it before, Birchas Kohanim only on Yom Tov. And here you see this idea, and you could understand it, right? The psychology of those who want to break away from this trauma of the last 2 years and want to walk away from the whole mess. And so one way is, let's just revert to the way things were back, and this is one way of coping with this difficult period. In fact, there's a very interesting passage in the Mishnah Lamelech, in Rambam Hilchos Gerish in Perek Gimel, Halacha Yud Gimel. And this is from the author of the Mishnah Lamelech, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Ruzanis. And he was the Rav in Constantinople. Now he was a little kid during this whole Maisa with Shabtai Tzvi. He was about 10 years old. But he writes in his Sefer an interesting story. What's to say? We know that when it comes to writing a get, you have to get the names perfectly right. So he writes over here a story in his city that there was a Maisa in Constantinople of a Jew who was about to die. And he wanted to give a get to his wife before he died. Why did he want to give a get to his wife before he died? Because they didn't have children. And he has siblings in other countries. If he dies without giving his wife a get, this woman now is skukka liyibam or chalitza. Go find the brother, right? This was a very big problem in those days. And now the issue is, Hitake wasn't a local from Constantinople. He was from Ashkenaz, he was from Germany. Okay, good. So he wants to give a get to his wife, he calls the cipher, they're arranging a get. A halt by starben, he's about to die. But this is what he's doing. Now here's the issue. His name, he went by Naphtali. From when he came to Constantinople, he went by Naphtali. And when they called him up in Shul, they called him up, Ya'ameh, the Reb Naphtali ben, whatever. That was how they called him up. His friends, the Ashkenazim, who moved with him to Constantinople, they would call him Hirsch, which is interesting, because Hirsch is not the parallel Yiddish name to Naphtali. Okay, now comes the moment of the get. He says, oh, by the way, my name, you should know, was Tzvi. My name always was Tzvi. When I came to Constantinople, I didn't want to be called Tzvi because I didn't want people to associate me with Shabtai Tzvi. And so therefore, in other words, there were people probably who were naming their children for him. And so he felt that there was a higher chance. He doesn't want to have that name. And so therefore he chose a different name. He chose the name Naphtali. Why Naphtali? I don't know, but this is the name he chose. Now, he used to sign his name on documents, Naphtali Tzvi Hirsch. This is what he says. That's how he used to sign his name. And on the ksuba with this woman who he married in Constantinople, he also signed it, Naphtali Tzvi Hirsch. Okay, so now at the get, what do? He wrote on the get, they wrote as follows. His name is Tzvi, Hamechuna Hirsch, the Miskarya Naphtali. This is the way they wrote the get. Now we're not going to get into the sugya of gittin, but the bottom line is it's a shaila if this is the right way to do it in this type of situation. And then they gave the get to the woman, he died. Now the shaila is it get a kosher get or is it a pasal get? If it's a kosher get, good. If it's a pasal get, this woman now needs chalitza from brothers who are in Ashkenaz. It's going to be hard to identify who they are. Okay. So maybe there's also an interesting topic about the namings for the get. It's not our topic here. It doesn't really matter. The answer doesn't matter. The answer, I don't want you to lose sleep over it. The answer was that it was considered a kosher get. That's what the Mishnah Melech Paskin. But why am I showing this here? I'm showing you another example of that generation of people who, this is part of the reaction. The reaction is, we started Birchas Kohanim because of that. Well, maybe we should stop it. Or, in this case, have a name Tzvi, not so associated, don't want that name, so let me change that name and let me go with a different type of name. Okay. So what's the shailas? What's the shaila? We still don't have a shaila yet. Back to the shailas of Shuvah, oh, Yaakov Simmons Hamaches. However, Ksas me'akol he'ma'akvim. Some people say, no, you got to keep the Birchas Kohanim every Shabbos. Why? The mitzvah sasehi. It's a mitzvah. And once we adopted that minig, you can't go back on it. So now this Rabbi Yitzchak is asking Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas, He's not asking the local Rabbanan in Amsterdam, because their opinions were well known, and most of them actually supported keeping Birchas Kohanim. So now he sends a letter all the way to Hamburg, knowing that Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas is the strong skeptic about everything related to Shabtai Tzvi, asking him, what do you think? Should we, you want to know, what do I think? So what does he think? Tshuva, he gives the following answer. Yes, it is true that Birchas Kohanim is a very important mitzvah. And it is true that the Beis Yosef said, Yashar Koach to Bnei Eretz Yisrael, who say it every day. Nonetheless, if it is true that initially they didn't say it, and they only did it on Yom Tov, and if it is true that the only reason they started this minig is because of the flawed belief in this false Mashiach, then it is the right thing is to revert back to the earlier minig. And then he says something interesting. After a little delay, so then if you all agreed to go to the minig, it's interesting, it doesn't say every Shabbos. If you go to the minig, then you can start a minig to do something else, to every single day. Every single day. So that's ma'toivu ma'noim, but you need to have a break. You need to separate it from this. In a later letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab. Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab at the time was was the chief rabbi in Amsterdam at the time. And Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab we had in a previous class. If you remember when we did about Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek Leilam Haba, that was Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab having a debate with Reb Shaul Halevi Mortera, right? Good. So this is Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab. And Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab is in correspondence with him. We're not going to learn so much of that piece. And later he clarifies to him that he thinks there needs to be a separation of 3 Yomim Tovim. In other words, a full year. You have to stop this minig for a full year. Then you could start it back. And once you're starting it back, might as well do it right. Do it every single day. And he says that the reason he's saying this point is because of 3 reasons. So let's go through his 3 reasons that Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas is presenting. Number 1 begins with a passage from the Mordechai. The Mordechai is one of the Rishonim from Ashkenaz. He passed away. He was actually killed al Kiddush Hashem in the late 1200s. He was a Talmud of Maharam in Rottenburg, and his commentary is printed. His Piskei Halach is printed in the back of the Gemaras. And he has in Maseches Megillah the following very interesting passage. He writes that he found in an earlier source, and he doesn't tell us who this source is, that a kohen who is not married, he calls him a panui, an unmarried kohen should not do duchenim. Now that's a shtickle bittul mitzvahs haseh, because if I'm 13 years old, I have a chiyuv already. And so you're telling me that, but if I'm unmarried, I shouldn't do it. Why? He says, because the Gemara says an unmarried man is unhappy. Hashari b'lo yisha, hashari b'lo simcha. And when you give a bracha, you need to be in a state of mind of happiness. And he brings 2 biblical rayas for this. The first biblical raya is from Yitzchak. That Yitzchak Avinu said, I want to give you a bracha. Good, give a bracha. No, but you need to go and get me some flesh, and then I'm going to give you a bracha. Ma kesher. What's this whole business of sending his bechor out to go get flesh? The reason is because he's going to have the meal, and then he's going to be in a better mood and in a better spirit, and that's a better way to give a bracha. So therefore, that's one raya. The second raya he brings from the Chanukah's base, Hamikdash Harishon, where the pasuk says that the Yidden gave a bracha to the Melech, and that very same pasuk also says that the Yidden were smeichim v'tuvei leiv, and so it's not a happenstance, it's b'diuk, because the Yidden were an ofen of simcha, they were able to give a bracha. And so therefore, the person who's unhappy, the unmarried person, this is what he's saying, shouldn't do the duchning. And the Alter Rebbe doesn't paskin this way. The Alter Rebbe thinks, what does that tell us? It tells us we do think we do think that a person could be, at least have enough simcha to be able to give a bracha. Okay, but this is what the Mordechai says. Comes along the Ramah, and the Ramah uses this as a precedent for something else. Something that we already grappled with. We already grappled with the issue of how come they developed this minig not to do Birchas Kohanim every single day. How did this happen? So what did we see? We saw the main reason we saw so far in the Mariel was the issue of mikvah. Secondarily, he threw in a few words about bittul malacha. Says that Ramah in Darchei Moshe says, I think the key words is those words of bittul malacha. That's the main reason. And not about the 1 minute of work that you're going to lose because Birchas Kohanim took an extra minute, because how does that make any sense? Who cares about those 60 seconds? That's not what it is. Bittul malacha doesn't really mean, don't take those words literally. He says, bittul malacha means the anxiety associated with malacha. And he goes on to explain, he gives a shtickle sob story, how we're living in such difficult times, and it's a struggle to make a living, and so every single day we're fachmurit, we're tzahakt, we're just unhappy. And so we're not in a state where we're able to give a bracha. And be'ikir, that's on a work day, because that's when we're thinking about our finances and our portfolio as nish beseder, that it's not good enough, and that's when we're not in a eifin of simcha. So that's the word. The bittul malacha is not that I'm not working during the minute, the extra minute that you took away. The bittul malacha is it's a work day. And it's a work day, I'm stressed out. Shabbos. So he comes in and says, Benegei Shabbos, I'm also stressed out. We're all stressed out, he says. We're worried about what happened this past week. We're anxious about what's happening in the coming week. He says, Yom Tiv, there you have the samachta b'chagecha. But Shabbos, his lashon is, on Shabbos, ve'einam shruyim kol kach b'simcha. We don't have a lot of simcha. It's interesting because connection to this week's parsha is that it says in the parsha, v'yem simchaschem v'mayadechem, so mayadechem is the Yom Tiv. So what's Yom Simchaschem, where you take out the chasoises? What's Yom Simchaschem? So Rashi actually doesn't say anything. Even Ezra says Yom Simchaschem is a day of victory when you win a war. But there's a Sifri, and the Sifri teaches Yom Simchaschem goes on Elo Shabbos. So that Shabbos is a day of Simcha. But Papoil, the poskim don't bring it. The poskim do not bring it, and this has an effect in different areas in halacha, which we're not going to get into right now. So this is what so I guess the reason I'm bringing that is what the Ramah is saying is that ein shruyim kol kach b'simcha, there is a value of simcha on Shabbos, but the fact that Jews aren't living up to it, it's not mamash hepach halacha, because although you have this thing, elu ha-Shabbosis, but it's not mamash halacha. V'lachein ends off the Ramah. Therefore, we have the minig not to duchen unless it's Yom Tif, when you're b'simcha. So what do you see? What did the Ramah do? He took the precedent from the Mordechai about the single person, and then he uses that to expand and justify the heter of why there's no duchening except for a few days during the year. Says Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas, now that you understand that, I'll give you a better Havana, my first reason for why we should revert to no Birchas Kohanim now. And what does he basically say? He says, Ka'es asher nesaf simcha v'gil mikol beis Yisrael. All joy has been stripped of the Jewish people. So ma bracha shayach loimer case. How come we're not in a state of bracha? Ki savar eider Hashem. The Jewish people thought, Ki melechecha di'aleh, and they're about to have the king of Mashiach. Uka'es, in reality, what happened? Nebcha shul yaseinu al panenu. This is a lashon and chazal to say that a pregnancy failed, and the child wasn't born. Mourning. A state of mourning. The katan sheberekim rak v'soichik b'fanenu. The emptiest of the empty people here, talking about the Gentile neighbors that they have, are harassing us and laughing at us and spitting in our faces. And some of us are knocking over our heads saying, Toivchin al panenu loimer, Ei Mashiach liYisrael. You see, he didn't come now, or it's false now, he's never going to come. So the Jewish people are so traumatized. So Mizani Yoimer, Ke'es Hashanedra, Simcha, now we're in a situation of no Simcha. Look at these earlier poskim. They tell us when there's no simcha, there's a justification for not doing Birchas Kohanim. So I think we should be living with it. We should be recognizing the gloom that we're in right now, recognize that reality, and this is reason number one for why he says that there should be no Birchas Kohanim at this time. Reason number two. Reason number two hinges on a sifri from this week's parsha, where we learn about the story of Pesach Sheni. Now, Ma'aseh of Pesach Sheni, it's very interesting, because Tayag mitzvahs came from, or the majority of the mitzvahs, the vast majority of the mitzvahs came in Or Yashar. Hashem told Moshe, who conveyed it to the Jewish people. All of a sudden we have a few instances and where it worked backwards. That Yidden came with a protest and a complaint. Why did it have to come out this way? So the Sifri says this on this week's Parsha, and Rashi quotes it. The MS is Ru'uya is a Parshas Tmeim Shetayomar Aydei Moshe. Really, this should also been Moshe Rabbeinu should have said. By the way, if you miss Pesach Rishon, there's going to be Pesach Sheni. Elo shezachu elu shetayomar al yedei. These people, these Tmeim, were zeicha that the whole thing was triggered by them. Lekach, why is that? Because we have a principle. What's the principle? Shemagalgalim schos al yedei zakai. That when we have a meritorious person, we allow that person to have additional schosim and to be the cause for additional schosim. V'choiva al yedei chayiv. When we have a person who's an evil person, who's a nefarious person, so then we're going to ensure that negative things come about from that type of person. And so therefore, these were tzaddikim. Why are they tzaddikim? So there's different shittas in the Medrash. Some say that they were metame to Yosef HaTzaddik. Some say they were metame to Nadav and Avihu. Some say that they were metame stamazoi tamas mitzvah. But either way, they were zakoyim. And so therefore, they got a schar, so to speak. That a great thing happened through them. One of the Taryag mitzvahs was given through them. And we say, by the way, a very similar thing about Bnei Slavchad, that these were Tayere Yiddish Freuen, and so therefore the Parsha of Nachlis came about through their complaint. That's a passage in Gemara and Baba Basra. And then the other way we say about the Mekoshesh, that really the din about what is the din of the Mechalel Shabbos and what Misa happens could have been given straight. But the reason it came about in this roundabout way is because we wanted it that through the Rasha, negative things, so to speak, happen. Negative stories, dinim about death, or so to speak, are given through the Chayim. This is the principle of Chazal. So now he's going to want to apply that to here. How's he applying it here? He doesn't want, to him it doesn't make sense in the Jewish paradigm that you should have such a schus, that a Kehillah Kedosha restarted such an important mitzvah, and the heels of him? No, from him should come chiyuvim, negativity. From him should come rishus. From him should come sad things should come. Mitzvahs and schusim should come from tzaddikim, not from negative people like this. And so in order to do this, he has to summarize how bad of a person we're dealing with over here. And so let's read the lines of how he describes Shabtai Tzvi. Here he says, Haloi noida ki shatzam harosha. And here he's going to explain the significance of shatzam. Right? I told you before, Shabtai Tzvi Moshiach. Why is he calling him Shabtai Tzvi Moshiach? Everyone was calling him at the time with this. This has to do a shtickle with astrology. Why is that? So basically like this. Shatzam Chanchal is the 7 planets. And in fact, any Jew who is involved in astrology would know these 2 acronyms and what they mean, because they're brought by Rashi, Masechah Shabbos, and in many places by Chazal. We spoke about it in some of the previous classes. This is the order of the 7 planets, and how each one is responsible for another hour of what goes on in this world. And the very first one is Shabtai, which corresponds to Saturn. And then the second hour is Tzedek, which corresponds to Jupiter. And the third one is Mem Madim, corresponds to Mars. And this cycle, the Gemara says, Rashi explains, this cycle exists from the moment the world was created until today. This concept of Shimush Hamazolis. So what they did is as follows. They said this Rosh Tevis Shatzam, Shabtai Tzvi Moshiach, has astrological significance in the sense that what comes after? What comes after is the 4th mazel is the sun, Chama. Chama is the sun. That's a metaphor for Mashiach. And they quoted the pasuk Lifnei Shemesh Yinoin Shmoi. Before the sun, Yinoin. It's a little bit of a hard word, but Rashi tells us Malchus Usrara. So it's about sovereignty. So Lifnei Shemesh, there's going to be Yinoin, his name will be sovereign. So before the 4th planet, Shemesh, Yinoin Shmai, his name is going to become sovereign. What's his name? Shatzam. Shabtai Tzvi Moshiach, those 3 planets coming before the 4th one, which is the sun. And this is what V'hu remez, it's a mistake in the page here. Shabtai Tzvi Moshiach ve'in gimel koich ve'leches, Shabtai Tzedek and Madim, which come before koich of Chama. And now, he liked to play with words, he says, and now it all changed around. Shabtai Tzvi, the mem now stands for Madim. Madim, we know from all the mazalas, that's the one that represents blood, that represents death, and indeed, he committed spiritual suicide by converting to Islam, he says. And then he gives a long list of mems over here. If you want a replacement for Mashiach, what could you use? See, he tells you, Mashchis, Mesis, Mediach, Machis, Megadef, Mumar, Meshukatz, Mesuav, Meshumad, and Muhammad, meaning Muhammad, because he converted to Islam. So he's giving you a lot of options here for what the mem could mean to replace it. He continues in this passage here to refer to him as a Navi Sheker, because if a person claims to be Mashiach when they have none of the criteria to be Mashiach, that renders them a Navi Sheker. He substantiates that point with numerous sources. And then he goes on to say, and look at the fact that he converted, and then he refers to the fact that he had a bad influence in 2 cities he specifies here. One is the city of Sofia, which is in Romania today, and the other is, he refers to the city of Ofen. Ofen is the German way of saying the city of Buda, which later became Budapest in Hungary. Okay, so what was the Maisa there? Basically, Tisha B'Av, a month or so before he converted to Islam, they were Mevatel Tisha B'Av. He said you don't have to fast, and there was no fasting. This is Tisha B'Av of 1666. And so now that he lists all of his sins, and I'm only showing you small parts of it, so he says, we're only giving schusim to people who are zakoyim. So v'lama naskim lizakoisai b'minig achadash hamisnag al yado v'sivasei. Who gives us the right to allow him to become the cause, to give him the schus for this new minig? So that is reason number 2. Reason number 1 we had was Hepech HaSimcha. Hepech HaSimcha is not a time to expand Birchas Kohanim. Reason number 2 is he shouldn't have this schus. Now, at the end of the day, he has to come to reason number 3. Reason number 3 is not an independent reason. The first 2 reasons are going to need reason number 3. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, if you have a mitzvah haseh, you need to do your mitzvah haseh. So what he needs to do is he has to loosen the mitzvah a little and say it's nishmamish a mitzvah haseh. How does he do that? The Gemara in Saita says, Kol koyin sheina oila leduchin is over in 3 assays. Why 3 assays? We referred to this earlier because the pasuk says koisav arachu. So you should make the bracha. Amar lahem, you should say, they tell them they should say. The Yidden should say to the kohanim should say to the Yidden. And it says with Samuel Shmi, they should place my name, which is another way of saying the kohanim should give brachas to Yidden. So therefore, it's 3 assays. So how do you get around that? So what's important over here is the Rosh. The Rosh of Maseches Megillah Perek Gimel quotes a Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi says about 2 Talmudic rabbis, how they lavdafke went up to Duchen. The first is Reb Ada Bar Pazi. So it says when he wasn't feeling well, he would just hide behind the beam. And that was like enough, and he didn't go up to Duchen. And then it says Rabbi Lazar would just leave. He would leave the shul and he would go outside, meaning he held it's not enough to hide behind a beam, you need to walk outside. Zok the Rosh, because this that we say that the kohen is over 3 assays, that's only kishachazin kohen. That's only when the chazan proclaims kohenim. Then the assay is triggered. Why is that? Where do we derive this? It's a very interesting place how this was derived. The Amar Lahem mitargaminon, because if you look at the Targum, you'll notice an aberration at the Targum. Usually Targum Onkelos sticks very, very close to the Hebrew words. But here, Amar Lahem, he doesn't say Amroin Lahain or whatever it would be. It says Kad Yemrun Lahain. And basically the way the Chachamim understand what Onkelos was saying was that when do you have the Chiyuv is when you are told. When you are told to announce it, then you have this chiyuv. So that's not clear in the pasuk, but it's the Targum Onkelos adding a word, which again is very unusual, and that turns into this only becoming a chiyuv when you, as a kohen, are told to say your bracha. It's the kad. Many people have looked at this Onkelos and trying to wonder, where did Onkelos get this from? Where did Onkelos get this chavdal? In fact, this also connects to one of the previous shurim we once did. That's because it was a Rav named Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolis. Lived in the 1700s, 1800s. Very important posek. So he has a sefer Shem Ephraim. On Parshas Nasa, he has a very interesting passage over there. He's matzia something that's very unusual for a rabbi to be matzia. He's matzia that is really a mistake. The whole Chav Dalid in the Targum Onkelos is a mistake. How is it a mistake? See, if you look, the pasuk Kaisav Aruch is Bnei Yisrael Amar Lahem is pasuk Chav Gimel, meaning Yevarechecha is pasuk Chav Dalid. So which means in the Targum Onkelos you would also have Chav Gimel Chav Dalid. So he's assuming, he says maybe what happened was that it said Chav Dalid, and then the person didn't realize that it's the number of the pasuk, and as a result of that, he put it in Kad Yemru Lahain, and really it's a misplacement of basically the numeral for the pasuk. This is what he suggested. But we know that it can't be true. Why can't it be true? It can't be true because, first of all, Prakim only enter into Ar Chomashim in the early 1500s, right? Even when the Prakim did, they never had the numerals for the Psukim. That's even later. I didn't even check to see when is the first one. But the Targum Onkelos, you can see in the earlier prints and even in the manuscripts, way before the adoption of the Perek and Psukim model, always had this Chav Daled there. So this idea is not possible. And we see Taka that in Halacha was taken very seriously. This whole din, that it's only triggered when the Chazan yells out, Koyanim, comes from this Targum Onkelos, from this Kad that you have in the Targum Onkelos. Al Kopanim, so once you have that, Zokt, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas, Umizeh Yuvan, look at number 14, Umizeh Yuvan, the aim bebitula nidun aveir, there's no aveir here. Again, if I fail to chas v'shalom, Yid fails to put on tefillin one day, it's bittul mitzvah hasei. But here it's not bittul mitzvah hasei. It's like, imagine sunrise never happened. Sunrise never happened, so there's no chiyuv yet to put on tefillin, because the chazan never called you out. It's a bittul hasei, the asim amele.
That's what it's a bittul aseh that's happening, so to speak, automatically. And so therefore he says, if the community agrees, if a community comes along and says, we only want to say it on Yom Tov, he thinks even lechatchila. It's not a terrible thing if a community says, by the way, we only want to do it on Yom Tov. Why? Because of the points of simcha and whatever it is, together with the fact that it only becomes a chiyuv once you say Amar Lahen, and maybe he's even going, and you don't have a chiyuv to go and to make that proclamation. It's interesting because the Alter Rebbe quotes this whole issue. Why don't we say Birchas Kohanim on every day in Siman Tov Chav Ches, I think, Reish Chav Ches, I don't remember. Anyway, where is it? We'll just get it for the record straight. Reish Chav Ches, Siman Reish Chav Ches, Siman Nun Zayin. So the Alter Rebbe there brings a whole arichis, and he brings this justification, that justification, what the Ramah said, mikveh, simcha, and then at the end he says, v'chol zeh ein yel al yashav haminig. All of this is only like retroactively to say, okay, we could justify the minig. But like that it should be lechatchila, it looks like the Alter Rebbe is not so happy about it. But Poyol, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas is a little more accepting, and he thinks the community could even lechatchila adopt it. Mikol Shekain, how much more so? In here in Amsterdam, it's to go back to your earlier minig, and then he adds another Kol Shekain, where, because you have a good intention. What's the good intention? Because because we don't want to give a schus to this person that's chayiv, and so therefore he thinks that this is the way to go. Now he sent this letter to Amsterdam, and obviously it went around. People over there, many of the Rabbanim there and communal members there disagreed, and they wanted to continue doing Birchas Kohanim. He writes in his sefer, he wrote a sefer, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas wrote a sefer called Tzitzas Neuvel Tzvi. Tzitzas Neuvel Tzvi, he never published it. It was only published for the first time in the 1950s. A kitzer of it was published in the 1700s. But what did he do? He basically took all the letters that he had written during this whole tkufa, because he's writing to everyone. He's writing to collect information and writing to say, stop, and this. He's fitting Tish a little about how he thinks the Jewish community should be handling this situation. So he takes all those letters and he ordered them and wrote in between them, like his commentary, this happened and that happened. So it's a very valuable source for people who want to study this topic. Tzitzas Neuvel Tzvi comes from a pasuk in Yeshaya. Tzvi means glory. Tzitzas could either mean a flower or a crown. Neuvel means it's corrupt, it's corroding, so it's like the glory, this is turning into a crown and a flower that is just withering away. And obviously it's a pun on Shabtai Tzvi's name as well. That's the name of the sefer. In this sefer he writes that he's chosheh, the people in Amsterdam want to keep it because they want to hold on a little to the belief, even though he converted already to Islam, right? So he doesn't write that clearly in his tshuva. He can't write that in this tshuva to them because that's not going to go over well. But he does write it in his own book. He writes that was part of his, that's something that's on his mind. Anyway, so let's turn to Tzitzas Neuvel Tzvi to see what happens next. So he writes that what happens next is that when the letter comes to Amsterdam, the rabbis there get all upset. And they say, Sheker v'chazav, it's not true. The takana of doing Birchas Kohanim on Shabbos has nothing to do with Shabtai Tzvi. It was just that the rabbi there, Rabbi Yitzchak Abuab, decided that this is a good idea to do it every single Shabbos, and so it has nothing to do with Shabtai Tzvi. So it was denial of the accusation, number one. Number two, v'gam im niskana b'shvilo, even if it was because of Shabtai Tzvi, they held en bekach klum, you got to stick to it. Why? Why you got to stick to it? So they brought interesting rayas. One of the rayas they brought is from Pirkei Avos. The Pirkei Avos in Perek Daled, we have a din that is quoted from Elisha ben Avuya. A din that's quoted from Elisha ben Avuya. So they said, Elisha ben Avuya, we know, later became a terrible person, became acher, and both morally, the things that he did as it's described in the Gemara, but on a religious level, on all levels, he became a very problematic figure, and yet we see that he's still quoted in the Mishnah. So if he's quoted in the Mishnah, so, even if someone's a Rasha, you think it's such a terrible idea that they're the source for a minig and a custom. If Elisha ben Avuya could be the source of this teaching in Pirkei Avos, so Shabtai Tzvi can be the source of a custom to do Birchas Kohanim every Shabbos. And then they brought another raya. The other raya they brought was from Gemara Chagiga Daf Tezvav Amud Beis. The Gemara describes Rabba Bar Shela having a conversation with Eliyahu Hanavi. And Eliyahu Hanavi reports to him the secrets that's going on in Shamayim. And he says that Kucha Brichu is repeating teachings, the Kulu Rabbanan, from all the rabbis. He's saying what they say. Umi Pume did Rab Meir loy kamar, not from Rab Meir. So Rabba Bar Shela asks Samai, why is Kucha Brichu not saying what Rab Meir says? So Kucha Brichu answers, Mishum de Kogamar Shmaitzim Apumad Acher, because he learned Torah from Acher. What a terrible thing. He's learning Torah from Acher. Elisha ben Avuya from Acher. Amar le Amai. What's the problem? Rabba Bar Shela asked. Rabbi Meir Rimay Matzah. He found a pomegranate. He ate the juicy, delicious seeds. Klipase Zarak, and he threw away the shell. In other words, he took the good of Elisha ben Avuya and he wasn't influenced by the bad. Amar le, Eliyahu said, wow, you did. Hashtaka Amar. Now that Kucha Brichu is actually saying stuff from Reb Meir, and it goes on to quote what teaching? Meir B'ni, and it goes on to quote the teaching which is not Negeh right now. So here you see, it's not such a terrible thing to learn from Acher. So it's not such a terrible thing to have a minig coming from Shabtai Tzvi. Well, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas gets this response back. It was a letter by a man named Reb David Dimmer Cardo, and he was not happy about this. And so he responds with his tshuva, which in his tshuva sefer Oyel Yaakov is printed in Siman Samach Tes. By the way, all of these tshuvas are also printed in the sefer Tzitzis Novel Tzvi as well. But for for hundreds of years, no, it was also, and in the Kitzur, it was also presented there as well, in that sefer. So he says, you say that Elisha ben Avuya wasn't erased from the Mishnah. In fact, I think he was. Because he's not written except for one time. In other words, Elisha ben Avuya probably had a lot of teachings. And in the entire Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, he's quoted one time, this one. And he goes on to say, is this halacha? Is this telling you what to do? Is this telling you not to do? Is it a din? Nothing. He says this doesn't matter. He says this is like, sometimes Chazal quote from Chochmas HaTeva. It doesn't address faith matters. And then he says, many times the Gemara even quotes from Goyim. So he doesn't see an issue over here. Why? Because it's not a halacha. He's like, find me a place where there's a halacha that comes from Elisha ben Avuya and that we're following. No, he thinks that maybe there was. And Rabbi Yehuda Anasi took out his razor and deleted all of those passages. Reb Meir is learning from Acher. So he says, I don't think that you can derive from that story that becomes permission for people to behave that way. It's a limud zchus, he says. La'adam acher, another person, lo yuhutar lechatchila lilmod me'adam rasha. A person is not allowed to learn from a rasha. Reb Meir is another story, is an exception to the rule. We'll talk about it more in a second. And how do I know this? Kid Rabbi Yochanan, because of the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. What's the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan? The teaching of Rabbi Yochanan is Chagiga das tevzvava mebei. Zak Rabbi Yochanan is there's a pasuk in Malachi. The parak of Malachi is talking to the Kohanim and the Leviim, and is telling them the achrayus that they have to Am Yisrael. And along the way, it says over there, Amalek Kohanim, they were the gold standard. And in that respect, the pasuk says, Kisifsei Kohen Yishmeru Das, that the lips of the Kohen guarded knowledge, the Torah Yavakshu Mepiu, and you would ask them for teaching, because they were like Hashem's angel. Good. Rabbi Yochanan darshans this pasuk and says that Torah Yavakshu Mepiu. When should you learn Torah from a certain person? If he's like a malach. If he's like a malach, Yavakshu Torah Mepiu, then you can learn from him. If he's not like a malach, Yavakshu Torah Mepiu, you're not allowed to learn from him. In other words, the character and the morality and the spiritual stature of the teacher, befedish, does matter. Unlike Reb Meir. You can say, what do you mean? It's knowledge, it's data. Let me get the data from this source. No, it's not that way. Torah is learned, Torah is not information. Torah is life. And you learn life from a living person. You can't learn life from someone who's internally dead. You get information from someone who's dead, but that's not what Limud Torah is. And therefore Rabbi Yochanan said the person has to be like a malach. The Gemara there asks, what about Reb Meir? What about Reb Meir? So the Gemara says, Reb Meir has a pasuk, that epis is mashma, that you could go to Elisha ben Avuya and get information. So then the Gemara says, okay, so then you have a stir of the two psukim. So the Gemara answers, no, what's the answer? Kan bekatan, kan begadol. What's that mean? A katan, we're worried, is going to be influenced
by a bad teacher, so therefore a katan can't have a bad teacher. A gadol is an adult, is more mature. He is not going to be influenced. He's impervious to negative influences, and so therefore he could have this teacher. He could have this teacher. Now, you learn that Gemara. When we all read that Gemara, it sounds like the Gemara, that's a maskana. The maskana, and you would expect that the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch would codify it in that way, that a person should learn for any teacher. If they're young, however, the person has to be morally upright. Well, guess what? We open the Rambam. Yaakov Sasportas is telling me all of this in his tshuva. We open the Rambam. Look what the Rambam paskins. Hilchos Talmud Torah Perek Daled Aleph. If the rabbi is no good, you're not allowed to learn from him. No exceptions. No exceptions. We just learned this in Rambam a few weeks ago. No exceptions. What happened? All the Mefarshim ask. What happened over here? We learned the Gemara. It sounds like kan bekat and kan begadol. And here the Rambam just says flat, no, usher. And that's the way it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch as well, including the Alter Rebbe and the Shulchan Aruch. So there's a lot of commentary on what the Rambam intends over here. Yaakov Sasportas says, I'll tell you very simple what happened over here. Rabbi Yochanan meant always, all people, no one should ever be learning from a negative teacher. Rabbi Meir clearly disagreed. So Rabbi Meir, we say, held, sometimes you're allowed to. But Reb Meir still has to contend with Rabbi Yechanan's pasuk. So alibo Reb Meir, we say there's a chiluk, kan bekotan and kan begadol. But all that is l'shittas Reb Meir. We don't pasuk like Reb Meir. We pasuk like Rabbi Yechanan. And Rabbi Yechanan lichatchila, in his mind, it's always, never allowed. The whole discussion of that led to the answer kan bekat and kan begadol is only a liba l'shittas Reb Meir, who clearly has a different opinion, but we don't follow his opinion. This is how Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas learns Pshat and Rambam, which would explain why the Rambam doesn't bring any exceptions. And so therefore, he comes back to them and he says, you told me Elisha ben Avuya? Elisha ben Avuya is never quoted for a halacha once. You told me Reb Meir? What did we just walk away with on understanding the halacha is not like Reb Meir? The halacha is not like Reb Meir, and the halacha is like Rabbi Yechanan. The person has to be doimel malach Hashem tzvakos. That's the only way we can learn from such a person. Otherwise, you gotta stay far away from them. And so he concludes his tshuva. Before we conclude, just a note on this Gemara, malach Hashem tzvakos. There's a ma'isa that is said, interesting ma'isa. I'm not entirely sure about the source, where the source of this ma'isa is, but about the two brothers, Reb Pinchas Bala Afla and Reb Shmelka of Nikolsburg, how they came to the Maggid the first time. And when they came to the Maggid, the story goes, they were very unimpressed because the Maggid didn't share any deep chidushim on Torah. And so after spending one Shabbos with him, they decided they're going to go back. They had heard great things about him. They're going to go back and they're going to part ways with the Maggid. So they came to say goodbye. The Maggid said, I have a student, Reb Zusha, please go talk to him before you leave. So they did that. They went to him. We get at learning. So Reb Zusha said he wants to ask them a shaila. Gemara says in Chagiga, learn from a teacher if they're doime l'malach Hashem tzvakos. Frechs says the shaila, do you ever see a malach? I never saw a malach. So how can you say learn from a teacher who's like a malach if I don't have whom to compare it to? I never saw a malach. So good shaila. So how do you answer? So he said, your teacher needs to be doime l'malach Hashem tzvakos, just like a malach is concealed from you and you don't know it and is mysterious and you don't know his milas. So too your teacher has to be someone who you don't really know his milas. He conceals his milas from you. Then you know he's an emissaire teacher. If he's putting everything out in front of you and stuffing it in your face, showing off, then he's not the right type of teacher. And they were thinking, and they got what Reb Zusha was trying to say. The fact that they didn't see gadlus by the Maggid is because the Maggid is doing l'malach Hashem tzvakos, who was concealing his gadlus. And so they decided, that's the Maisa, they decided to stay, and the rest is history. So that's an interesting Maisa about that inyan. I'll also say the following, that the maskana lahalacha, according to the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, is unlike Reb Meir. There's no exception for a gadol. I know I'm a gadol, and I know that I'm influenced by things around me. Like this idea, it's like thank you very much. I'm glad that you believe in me so much. But this idea that only when I was till 13, that's when I would have been influenced by a negative thing. But after that, I'm good. It's not true. Until today, when I'm in an environment that brings out negativity, so it brings out negativity. So I think we just in terms of what we see by Muchish, I think we could understand why the Rambam went in the direction he went. And we all know that famous passage in Rambam where he says the Derech Shal Adam is to be influenced by surrounding, not a katan, Derech Shal Adam, everyone. That's a good. There's a Maisa of a chassid who came to the Tzemach Tzedek. This is brought in L'Shem HaOizen, Rabbi Duchman. And he said that he has apikursim in his city, in Lepla. And he wants to know, how to answer them. So the Tzemach Tzedek told him, apikursim like these you're not allowed to speak to. I the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, apikoides is the internal apikoides. And the Mishnah is saying, da ma shatoshel apikoides. Da soll wissen sein as ma. Ma is bittel. With bittel, with the power of bittel, you're able to address the internal apikoides. Okay, good. Fine. Now, so back to Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas. So he feels like he adequately defended his psak because the proofs from Acher and the proofs from the negative teacher and the proofs from are down. And so therefore he concludes in number 22 and he writes as well. He writes as follows. If you want to tell me denial, that it never happened, the whole thing started, nothing to do with Shabtai Tzvi, no problem, then I'll accept it. And if you want to tell, but tonight, the whole kehillah needs to be behind it, because you can't start a new minig if Roiva the kehillah is against it. So he says, two tanoim, if it has nothing to do with Shabtai Tzvi, and Roiva the kehillah supports it, be my guest, I'm supporting you as well, I have no problem whatsoever. Why? Obviously, it's better to do it every single day. But he said, that's not what you guys did. You mentioned that, but then you went on an affirmative defense to say, oh, and by the way, even if it was Shabtai Tzvi, and that he says, absolutely not. There's a long hemshech of mechtavim here, because he ended up writing letters to other rabbanim. He ended up writing a letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab, in addition to the letters that we've seen. He ended up writing a letter to a Rav in Livorno. He ended up writing a letter to the Kehillah in Amsterdam. He ended up writing a letter to Venice, all about this subject, expanding on many of the ideas that we were talking about, getting into sugyas such as Bittul HaMinig, which is a fascinating standalone sugya. This sugya over here of gaining knowledge from non-kosher sources is very much discussed over here, as well as the sugya itself of Birchas Kohanim and the Bittul Asay of it. So it's a very good sugya to learn a lot of beautiful things. But Poyol, the end of the story was that they continued saying it on Shabbos in Amsterdam. They were not mavatal it, not even for a year as far as we can tell. And the result was that this added to the chilukim minhagim. And there was chilukim minhagim we saw in the times of the Beis Yosef, who alluded to the fact that there was a chilukim minhagim. And ad hayom, there's chilukim minhagim, with some places just doing it on Yom Tov, some places just doing it also on Shabbos, and some places doing it every single day. And there's a tradition that they would say in Lubavitch about the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe wanted to bring back Birchas Kohanim, because we saw already in the Shulchan Aruch that he wasn't so excited about the heter not to. And the Rabbi Dvorkin in his memoirs wrote about this, and Rabbi Perlov in the Kutei Sipurim wrote about it, that the lashon was Iya Yashar Cheli, that if I had the strength, I would bring it back. And the Rebbe once wrote, like, what does that mean? The Alter Rebbe wrote a new nusach hatfilah, so he didn't have the ability to do it. What does that mean? So we don't know exactly what it means, but the bottom line is he didn't end up reinstituting a Birchas Kohanim every day. And so when the Rebbe was asked these types of questions, he said, I don't know why the Alter Rebbe didn't. So because I don't know why the Alter Rebbe didn't, so how am I even supposed to get involved in this conversation? If I know the reason why someone said no, so then we can open a conversation about what about today. But now, because Alter Rebbe had a svara, and he decided not to do it, and we don't know why, so basically we're going to wait taka till the Emes HaMashiach comes, and then l'chayra, that's when we're going to go back, snap back to doing it in the proper way in Eretz Yisrael. But I want to conclude with the inyan of Elisha ben Avuya, because he loomed just now large. And I want to conclude with a verse from the Rebbe about him, from the Sikh of Shabbos Parshas Emer Tavshin Mem Beis. The Rebbe asked the question, and that is, what is the purpose of this Mishnah? If you learn Torah, what's the content of the Mishnah? So we didn't read it before. When you learn Torah as a child, it's similar to ink that's written on new parchment. When, however, you learn Torah as an older person, it's similar to ink that is written on a used and erased parchment, which obviously the letters don't hold as well. What's the message over here? I'm an Elter Yid, and I'm reading this Pirkei Avos, and I'm like, oh, okay, so my Torah learning is less impressive and leaves less of a mark than a child. Like, what's the inspiration I'm supposed to be taking from here? The Rebbe spoke about the Goydel Ilui of Elisha ben Avuya in this Sikha, which is very interesting because we're used to the Rebbe doing that in many other areas, but many other famous. This Sikha is a little less well known about bringing out the mile of Elisha ben Avuya. What was the mile of Elisha ben Avuya? There have been many people throughout history who walked away from Yiddishkeit. In fact, great Talmid Chachamim who walked away from Yiddishkeit. What's unique about Elisha ben Avuya, at least in Safros Chazal, is that he's someone who walked away, but at the same time he remained connected. He's still talking to Reb Meir. And in fact, even during a moment of Chilul Shabbos, when he's riding on his horse on Shabbos, Reb Meir is with him, he's telling Reb Meir, Ad Cham Chilul Shabbos. So in a moment that he himself is doing Chilul Shabbos, he wants to make sure that a Yid who does care about Shabbos is going to actually observe it properly and reminds him about it. And Bechlal, during this whole Tkufa, he's sharing Torah and wisdom with Reb Meir, even if we don't have the specifics of those teachings. That's a highly unique thing. And so in here we need to ask the question, what happened that for so many others, they were Shanu Pirish? But for Elisha ben Avuya, even as there was Pirish, he's still engrossed, he's still engaged on some level. What's Pshat? How did this happen? And the answer is, this also explains why this is the one Mishnah Rebbe left. Why is this the one Mishnah the Rebbe left? Because this Mishnah is going to be the key to the Elisha ben Avuya enigma. Because what is the Mishnah saying? It's saying when you teach Torah to a child, it's like ink on a fresh parchment, where it's going to stay really, really well for a long time. That's exactly what happened with Elisha ben Avuya. Because the Gemara in Yerushalmi describes how very different from most parents his father brought into the base medrash and earlier and more often than anyone else. So that was mamish the inyan of the diyoi written on a Yor Chadash. And that's why, even though it ended up being that he fell away, he never really fell away, because it can't be erased, because it's ink on a fresh piece of parchment, so it stayed with him forever. And so therefore, when Rebbe wants to give you this teaching, he's going to put Elisha ben Avuya's name. He has to put Elisha ben Avuya's name. He's the living example. He's the evidence. He's the evidence, case study number one for this idea. So of course he leaves his name in, Elisha ben Avuya. And now you can understand why you have this mission over here. This mission over here is telling us to be motivated about teaching Tanim. The way the Rebbe said it in the Sikha, how much we need to be involved in teaching young children. And the Rebbe added, even before the child understands the difference of good and bad, we want to give the child a hislavos, that is the application of this idea of taking the ink and applying it to a parchment where it's going to stick. If you open the Pirkei Avos, you see interesting that the Meir immediately says right after the famous teaching, Al tistako bekankan elav masha yeshbay. Don't look at the barrel, look what's inside. Ma kesher, you see the kesher right away. That was Reb Meir. Reb Meir said, look at this treasure, Elisha ben Avuya, look what's on his inside. Don't look at the exterior, look at the resource, the neshama, and all the positivity that he has within him, and I'm going to tap into that. Good, so now you understand the whole mission over here. And the Rebbe concludes saying, however, this is not for everyone. Why? Because the Rebbe is following the Alter Rebbe, who's following the Rambam, who doesn't bring the distinction of Katan v'Gadol, because the reality is that most people, even someone who's an older person and very, very mature, is negatively influenced. The Meir was a highly unique person who wasn't, and because of that, because of him being highly unique, and in addition, as the story shows, the Maisa was after the fact, meaning the Rabbah Bar Shela said, and Yaakov Sasportas points this out, he says, Rameh already passed away. Did anything negative come out? He demonstrated that he took the peel and threw it away and ate the good fruit that's on the inside. So it's not only something for maybe is going to happen or what he's trying to do. He successfully did it. So because he successfully did it, he ran through a line of fire. You're never going to suggest anyone do it, but look, he made it out to the other side. Okay, that's the D-Day reference. So he made it out to the other side. So we'll look at the Meir and we'll say, okay, so look, it had no negative. So even if it's a shtickle wrong, because it had no negative impact, so you could repeat his toitus, and that's what happened. But legabe, every person, this is not something that we do. Akopanim, I'm a kohen. So because I'm a kohen, so I give you all the brachas, all of the brachas from Birchas Kohanim that we heard on Shavuos should become real things in our lives, and it should be nimshach in our lives all the way till next Rosh Hashanah.